the city. Okay. So what is the Heian period characterized by? If you want to know what the Heian period was in this one slide, as I tried to summarize it as succinctly as I could, but essentially you have a very strong central government that's controlled by the emperor, but also, unlike the Buddhist monks who had a lot more, unlike the Nara period where you have the Buddhist monks yielding a lot of power, the monks don't have as much power as they did in the Nara period in the Heian period. Okay, so in other words, even though the emperor is still at the top of this strong central government, the wealthy aristocratic families who served the emperor, they were aristocrats, they were nobles, they supported the imperial family. These families start to yield a lot more power in the Heian period, and that's because they all lived in Kyoto. They lived very close to the emperor's palace, so they had a lot of easy access to him. Okay. And even though the influence of the Buddhist monks start to wane, it doesn't mean that Buddhist influence in Japan stops. If anything, Buddhist influence during the Heian period increases. Okay, you have a lot of new Buddhist influence. We'll talk about that in a couple of slides. But you also have this flowering of classic Japanese culture. Classical literature, architecture, art really begins to flourish. And most of what you think of as Japanese art or Japanese culture is developed during this Heian period. Okay? Unfortunately, however, just like with the Nara period, the provinces don't change. And life for poor farmers in the countryside is rather the same. They basically lived on private estates that were owned by monasteries, Buddhist monasteries, or by the aristocrats. So they worked on these estates. They were given a little bit of land, and this was the land that they were allowed to, it was like a sharecropping system. Essentially, they had to work the land, and they had to give up all their rice to the aristocratic families or to the monasteries, who would then sell the rice or use it for themselves. And the farmers essentially they basically received a little bit of rice, and that's all that they could eat to feed their family. And so they had no land, no freedom. They essentially lived for their entire lives and worked for their entire lives on these private estates. So the peasants were basically not allowed to participate in the classical life of the Heian period. The missions to China, which was started by Prince Shotoku in the Asuka period, they continued during the beginning part of the Heian period. So the Japanese still believed that they had a lot to learn from China, and they needed to learn even more, especially about Buddhism, because during this period in China, there was a lot of new Buddhist denominations, new Buddhist sects, which were coming to fruition, and so Japan felt that it needed to learn more about Buddhism. And so the imperial family would still send monks and students to China to study. So in the year 804, 10 years after the move to Kyoto, Emperor Kanmu sends 2 Buddhist monks to the Chinese capital city, Chang'an, to study Buddhism. And these 2 monks would change the history of Japanese Buddhism forever. Their names were Saicho and Kuka. Okay. So the first one, Saicho, he studies Buddhism in China for 1 year, and in 805 he returns to Japan and he founds a new sect of Japanese Buddhism known as Tendai Buddhism, a very important sect which I'd like you to remember. Tendai Buddhism is associated with a certain temple outside of Kyoto, okay, Enryakuji Temple. So it was situated outside of Kyoto. And specifically, it was located on the very top of a mountain known as Mount Hiei, okay? And it's the northeast part of Kyoto where this Enryakuji temple, the Tendai Buddhism temple, Enryakuji, was situated. And the reason it was put on the top of this particular mountain was old legend stated that evil spirits would invade the capital city from the northeast, which is where Mount Hiei was located. So the legend stated that if evil spirits ever came to the capital, they would come from this direction. So Enryakuji was put there as a sort of guardian temple against these evil spirits. Okay, but do you think there was maybe a political decision why Enryakuji Temple was put here? Think about why the emperor might have wanted this temple, Enryakuji, as far away from the capital city as possible in relative isolation. That'll be one of your discussion questions. Think about why he did not want to build this temple inside Kyoto, and why did he want to put it outside Kyoto? Okay, so think about that for a moment. But Saicho, the monk, and his Enryakuji temple received official support, financial support, of course, from the imperial family. So Saicho's Tendai sect of Buddhism, whose headquarters are at Enryakuji Temple, this sect is essentially characterized by a Buddhist text, it's called a sutra, a holy text known as the Lotus Sutra. Okay, and Tendai Buddhism teaches that anybody, whether you're a peasant, you're a farmer, you're an aristocrat, you're the emperor, anybody can reach enlightenment on their own and become a Buddha if they believe and if they chant the Lotus Sutra on a regular basis. Okay, and they also open the door to everybody, even commoners, to become Buddhist monks. So anybody could become a monk. If you didn't want to be a farmer anymore, you could show up to Mount Hiei, to Enryakuji Temple, and you could become a monk. Okay? So unlike the Nara period, where you have Buddhism is sort of very difficult to understand, sort of magical, removed from the common people, Tendai sort of begins to open the door a little bit. Not completely, okay? But begins to open the door a little bit to the common people, okay? Because if you don't know how to read, how are you going to read the Lotus Sutra, right? So yes, you could go to a temple and maybe you could learn how to read or become a monk and learn how to read, but at least it made the attempt to open the door to common people to teach them about Buddhism. And as such, Tendai becomes the most popular sect of Buddhism during the Heian period, and Tendai monks become very popular. Okay? There was another monk who goes to China to study Buddhism in the year 804. His name was Kukai. Okay? And when he's in China, Kukai meets a Buddhist monk. His name was Keika, okay, who was a very elderly monk in China at that time. And Keika taught Kukai everything he knows about something called esoteric Buddhism. Okay? So Keika teaches Kukai for 3 straight months, and then he suddenly passes away. Okay? And when he passes away, he tells Kukai that you are now my heir, and you will go back to Japan and teach everybody what I've taught you. So 2 years later, in 806, Kukai returns to Japan, and just like what his master told him, he decides to spread esoteric Buddhism to everyone he meets. Okay, and so Kukai founds the sect of Buddhism known as the Shingon sect of Buddhism. And unlike Tendai, Shingon was full of mysticism, rituals, magic, okay? It was a secret. You couldn't learn everything about it until you became a monk yourself. And then, you couldn't tell everybody. You would have to pick one person to sort of pass on these secret rituals to, and then, they would carry it on. So it was a very exclusive sect of Buddhism. And Shingon Buddhism is very complicated. Essentially, they worship a Buddha named Dainichi, okay? And this particular Dainichi Buddha has several lesser Buddhas surrounding him who complement Dainichi Buddha. So it's a very hierarchical nature. You have Dainichi Buddha at the top, and then these lesser Buddhas serving him at the bottom. So as you might have surmised, Shingon Buddhism was actually the favorite sect of the imperial family and the Kyoto aristocrats. Why do you think so? Take a minute and think about why Shingon was so popular among the imperial family. Well, keep in mind that the imperial family and their aristocratic colleagues loved rituals, right? They're very, very big on social class hierarchy with the emperor at the top, the aristocrats under him, lesser aristocrats under them, etc. So they're very big on this aristocratic sort of system, social class hierarchy, and they love rituals. And so because Shingon has all of these things, the imperial family and the Kyoto aristocrats really took a liking to Shingon. It really it complemented their view of how political systems should be. And they were very big on ceremonies and rituals anyway, and since Shingon had this, it was very easy to sort of accept Shingon as the official Buddhist sect of the imperial family, okay? And actually, it was very easy to complement Shingon Buddhism with Shintoism, because Dainichi Buddha was seen by the imperial family as being similar to the sun goddess. And the lesser Buddhas who supported Dainichi Buddha were compared to the various kami, the various gods of Shintoism. So it's very similar and easy to bring Shingon Buddhism and Shintoism together, and for this reason the imperial family was a very big fan of Shingon. Kukai founds an official center devoted to Shingon Buddhist study at Mount Koya. Okay, this is another mountain besides Mount Hiei. So Mount Koya houses the official center of Shingon Buddhism outside of Kyoto. Again, away from the capital city. Why do you think the imperial family wants them as far away from the capital as possible? Think back to why they had to leave Nara in the first place. Okay, and Kukai also founds a temple in Kyoto, a small temple known as the Toji Temple. So don't confuse Tendai and Shingon. Okay, Tendai is associated with the Lotus Sutra, right? Shingon is associated with esoteric rituals and mysticism. Shingon is associated with Mount Koya, and Tendai is associated with Enryakuji Temple on Mount Hiei. Okay. Shingon is very famous for using mandalas, which were often painted on scrolls. You could see an example of a mandala here. And these were used to help with meditation, and they were seen as having magical powers. So it was believed that if you worshipped and meditated using the mandala, you would reach reach a new part of yourself, and you would reach enlightenment. It was helping with meditation and attaining this Buddhahood, so to speak. So it was used a lot during rites and rituals. But as you can guess, Shingon was very, very difficult for the common people. Okay, it mainly appealed to the imperial court, the emperor, and the aristocrats. Okay, and so it was very difficult. Unlike Tendai, which at least tried to include the common people, Shingon never even attempted to get the common people to join because it was so mystical and so exclusive. Okay, but both the Tendai Center at Mount Hiei and the Shingon Center at Mount Koya, they were both quite far from Kyoto, so it was very isolated. It wasn't easy to get there. It was not really a part of the city of Kyoto, so to speak. Okay, what happens though is, unfortunately for the imperial family, these monasteries, because they were so isolated, because they were so far removed from the city of Kyoto, they became very, very big. Okay, huge, much larger than Todaiji Temple ever was. They became very powerful, and they became isolated. So things could happen there that were unknown to the emperor or to the aristocrats. So they kind of were their own, almost they began to have their own power, their own mini government almost, because they were so isolated from the capital. Architecture slightly changes during the Heian period as well. Most of the buildings, including the Buddhist temples, the imperial palace in and around Kyoto, they all had thatched roofs with citrus bark, okay? And the floors were all elevated above the ground, okay? So you were always elevating. Unfortunately, many of these buildings from the early Heian period have all burned down, okay? Because they're all made of wood, okay, and it was very easy for them to catch on fire. So various natural disasters and wars over the centuries means that if you want to find original buildings from the beginning of the Heian period, from the 800s, you're not going to find any. But one example of very, very early Heian period architecture is the Kyoto Imperial Palace, which you can still attend and go to. This is a picture of it. This dates from that period, and it's an example of early Heian period architecture. Okay. Also, with the advent of Tendai and Shingon, Buddhism into Japan, sculpture, which had been crafted in bronze before, and clay, it really starts to drift away from that. Bronze is not used anymore as much as it used to be during the Nara period or the Asuka period. Instead, Buddhist statues were carved out of wood. So an artist would take a single block of wood, and they would essentially create these beautiful masterpieces, as you can see in this picture here, all by hand. It was hand carved, and they used very little paint. It wasn't very ornamental, very simple. And this was, again, very popular in China during this time. China also starts to drift away from bronze and clay and begins to use wood, and so Japan also borrowed this during and started using it during the Heian period, wooden sculpture. So in the beginning of the Han period, everything is fine. There's still a lot of Chinese influence in Kyoto. The imperial family, the aristocrats, they loved Chinese poetry, culture, art, Buddhism, everything. Okay, but in 838, the official missions and, in fact, all diplomatic relations with China were terminated. Okay, Japan isolates itself from China and completely cuts itself off. In other words, nobody else can go to China to learn. The missions that were enacted by Prince Shotoku 200 years before were terminated. You could no longer go to China to study, and Japan and China no longer had diplomatic relations. Why do you think this was the case? Well, there's two reasons. First reason behind the termination of the China trade, in other words, you couldn't even trade with China anymore. There was no more, you couldn't get anything from them, legally at least. Japan was completely cut off from China. Okay, there's two reasons for this. Number one, war and violence in China. China, which had been ruled by the Tang Dynasty and was relatively stable for many years, the Tang Dynasty begins to decline during this period. And so there's a lot of internal strife, civil wars, and unrest, civil unrest in China. So the Japanese government feels that it was no longer safe to send anybody to China. Who knows what could happen there on the way or when you're there, right? And also, focus on Japanese culture. Japan feels that, you know what, we've been accepting and getting new things from China for the last 3-4 centuries. We need a little break, okay? So for the rest of the Heian period, instead of getting new things from China, the Japanese people begin to focus on developing their own art, literature, and poetry with a more Japanese twist to it. In other words, they want to focus on really refining their own culture and creating their own culture instead of getting it from China. So they felt that they've really learned enough from China and that they need a little break for now. By the way, remember Kukai? He founded Shingon Buddhism. If you've taken Japanese class, you've probably learned about Japanese hiragana and katakana, the phonetic syllables that represent the actual Japanese sound system. Kukai is credited with creating these syllables. So if you've learned hiragana and katakana, you can thank Kukai for creating them for you. So now, as a result of creating a uniquely native Japanese writing system, literature and poetry can be written by anybody, because it's much easier to learn Japanese kana than the Chinese characters, than the kanji, which took such a long time to learn.